HOA, Karen demands I pay rent for the house I fully own. This is the story of how an entitled HOA president tried to convince me I was a renter in my inherited home and attempted to extort thousands in back rent from me. Spoiler alert, it didn't end well for her. Some background. My grandfather passed away last year, leaving me his house in a nice suburban neighborhood. He'd owned it outright since the 1970s, long before the HOA was established in the early 2000s. When the developers came in to build new houses around the existing ones, my grandfather had explicitly refused to join their HOA. He had the paperwork to prove it and everything. The house needed some work. Grandpa hadn't been able to maintain it properly in his final years, but it was structurally sound and in a great location. My wife and I were thrilled to have a home of our own, especially in this market. We spent the first month fixing it up, painting, and making it our own. That's when the trouble started. One morning, I was drinking coffee on the front porch when a black Mercedes SUV pulled into my driveway. Out stepped this woman in designer workout clothes, tablet in hand, looking like she was ready to close a major business deal rather than go for a jog. "Good morning," she called out with fake cheerfulness. "I'm the HOA president. We need to discuss your residence situation." I stood up, confused but trying to be polite. "Oh, hello. I inherited this house from my grandfather. Is there something wrong?" Her smile tightened. "Yes, actually. According to our records, this property is an HOA rental unit. You haven't paid any dues or rent since moving in, and there are several violations we need to address." I nearly choked on my coffee. "I'm sorry, what? This isn't a rental. My grandfather owned it outright, and now I do. We're not even part of your HOA." She let out a condescending laugh. "Oh, sweetie, that's not how it works. All properties in Oak Ridge Estates are HOA managed. You owe back dues from the past 5 years when your grandfather stopped paying, plus rent for your current occupancy. It comes to about $47,000. I stood there, mouth agape. Was this woman serious? "Look," I said firmly, "I have all the paperwork showing my grandfather owned this house. He never joined your HOA. I inherited it free and clear. I'm not paying you anything." Her smile disappeared completely. "Listen here, you can either pay what you owe or we'll begin eviction proceedings. Your choice." With that, she turned on her heel and strode back to her Mercedes, leaving a letter in my mailbox as she left. I grabbed it. It was an official-looking notice demanding payment within 30 days or face eviction. I immediately called my wife, who works as a paralegal. She told me to gather every piece of documentation we had about the house and not to talk to the HOA president again without a lawyer present. That afternoon, I went through all of Grandpa's files. Thank goodness he was meticulous about keeping records. I found the original deed from 1972. Property tax records showing his ownership. A letter from 2002 explicitly refusing to join the HOA. Proof he'd never had a mortgage. Recent property tax payments in his name. I scanned everything and emailed it to my wife, who showed it to one of the lawyers at her firm. He agreed to take my case and said the HOA president's claims were completely bogus. But things were about to get much more interesting. A few days later, I came home to find a notice of violation taped to my door. Apparently, I was in violation of multiple HOA rules: unauthorized paint color, unapproved landscaping, incorrect mailbox height, and about a dozen other ridiculous things. Each violation carried a $100 fine. I called my lawyer immediately. He advised me to document everything but not to pay a cent. He also suggested I do some digging into the HOA's practices. That's when I had an idea. I posted on our neighborhood Facebook group asking if anyone else had dealt with similar issues. The responses were eye-opening. Several elderly residents reported being pressured to pay bogus back dues. A couple who had also inherited a pre-HOA house said they'd been harassed about fictional rental payments. One person even said they'd paid thousands before realizing they weren't actually HOA members. Would you like me to continue with what happens next? The story was just getting started. Armed with this information, my lawyer filed a formal complaint with the State Attorney General's office about the HOA's predatory practices. We also filed a civil suit against the HOA and its president personally for harassment and attempted fraud. But the HOA president wasn't backing down. Over the next few weeks, she escalated her harassment. Daily violation notices on my door. Letters threatening to put a lien on my house. Tow trucks showing up trying to remove my unauthorized vehicles from my own driveway. HOA inspectors taking photos of my house and trying to peek in windows. Attempts to shut off my utilities claiming I wasn't the legal resident. I documented everything meticulously. Security cameras caught them in the act multiple times. Every letter, every photo, every incident went into a growing file of evidence. Then came the breaking point. I came home one day to find a locksmith trying to change my locks. The HOA president had told him I was an unauthorized tenant being evicted. Thankfully, I had my ID and paperwork readily available to prove I owned the house. That incident was the last straw. My lawyer filed for an emergency injunction to stop the HOA's harassment. We had a hearing scheduled for the following week. The day of the hearing, I walked into the courtroom armed with a mountain of evidence. The HOA president showed up with 2 lawyers, looking smug as ever in an expensive suit. Her smirk disappeared pretty quickly once our evidence started coming out. First, we presented the original property records proving my grandfather's ownership and explicit refusal to join the HOA. Their lawyer tried to claim those documents were outdated, but the judge wasn't buying it. Then came the testimonies. Several neighbors had agreed to testify about the HOA's harassment and fraudulent demands for payment. One elderly woman broke down crying as she described how they'd pressured her into paying thousands in fake back dues after her husband died. But the real bombshell came when we presented financial records we'd subpoenaed. Turns out the HOA president had been running quite a scam. She had created fake rental agreements for properties the HOA didn't own, pocketed violation, fines that weren't recorded in HOA books, used HOA funds for personal expenses, forged documents claiming authority over non-HOA properties, operated a separate bank account for her illegal collections. The judge's face got darker with each new piece of evidence. By the time we were done, she looked ready to explode. "This is one of the most egregious abuses of HOA authority I've ever seen," she declared. The court grants an immediate injunction against any further harassment of the plaintiff. Furthermore, I'm referring this matter to the district attorney's office for potential criminal charges. The HOA president's face had turned ghostly white. Her lawyers were already packing up their briefcases, probably realizing what a mess they'd stepped into. But we weren't done yet. Remember all those neighbors who'd been scammed? My lawyer had filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of everyone who'd been fraudulently charged by the HOA. The evidence we gathered was more than enough to prove a pattern of deliberate fraud. The HOA's insurance company took one look at the evidence and immediately tried to settle. They offered $250,000 to make it all go away. We refused. "This isn't about money," I told my lawyer. "This is about holding them accountable and making sure they can't do this to anyone else." The case went to trial. Over the course of a week, neighbor after neighbor testified about the HOA's harassment and fraud. The HOA president tried to claim she was just enforcing the rules, but her own financial records proved otherwise. The jury took less than 2 hours to reach a verdict. They awarded $500,000 in damages to be split among all the victims, $100,000 in punitive damages against the HOA president personally, a court order dissolving the current HOA board, mandatory oversight of any new HOA board for 5 years. The HOA president was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs. The DA had decided to press criminal charges for fraud and extortion. As for me, I still live in my grandfather's house, which I've fixed up nicely. The new HOA board, elected under court supervision, knows to leave me alone. My non-HOA status is now clearly recorded with the county to prevent any future confusion. Sometimes when I'm sitting on my freshly painted porch, in a color no HOA ever approved, I think about how my grandfather's meticulous record-keeping saved me from this scam. I've started keeping detailed records of my own, just in case. The best part? Several of my neighbors have now successfully withdrawn from the HOA, using the legal precedent set by my case. The HOA's power has been significantly reduced, and they're now under strict oversight to prevent any future abuse. I'd call that a pretty satisfying victory. Edit: Wow, this blew up. Thanks for all the supportive comments. To answer some common questions. 1. Yes, the criminal case is still ongoing. I'll post an update when there's a verdict. My grandfather's documentation literally saved me tens of thousands of dollars. Keep your paperwork, folks. 3. Several people have asked about the HOA president's other bank account. The forensic audit is still happening, but it looks like she stole close to $300,000 over 5 years. 4. My wife's law firm is now handling several similar cases in other neighborhoods. Turns out this is more common than we thought. Edit 2. For those asking, no, I haven't seen the former HOA president since her arrest. Word is she's frantically trying to sell her house before sentencing. Karma's funny that way. Update: 6 months later. You guys won't believe how this all played out. The criminal case finally concluded, and holy cow, it was even worse than we thought. During the trial, the forensic accountants discovered that our HOA president scam went way beyond just our neighborhood. She had been running similar schemes in 3 other HOA communities where she served on committees. The total amount stolen was closer to $800,000. The evidence was overwhelming. The prosecution found multiple hidden bank accounts in different cities, fake rental agreements going back almost 10 years, a detailed spreadsheet of all her targets, mostly elderly homeowners and people who had inherited houses, evidence she'd bribed county clerks to lose property records, offshore accounts where she'd been stashing the money. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Her defense tried to claim she was just overzealous in enforcing HOA rules and had misunderstood property laws. The jury didn't buy it for a second. She was found guilty on all counts. 23 counts of fraud, 12 counts of extortion, 8 counts of falsifying official documents, 5 counts of criminal harassment, 3 counts of bribing public officials. The judge didn't hold back at sentencing. She got 15 years in prison and has to pay back every penny she stole, plus damages. They've frozen all her assets and are selling her properties to help pay restitution. Her husband filed for divorce as soon as the verdict came in. Turns out he had no idea what she'd been doing. She had convinced him all the extra money was from smart investments. He's cooperating with authorities to help track down the rest of the stolen funds. The fallout in our community has been intense but mostly positive. The HOA has been completely restructured with strict oversight. All financial decisions now require multiple approvals and regular audits. Property records have been updated to clearly show which homes are HOA members and which aren't. Several other HOA presidents in the area have resigned, probably worried about increased scrutiny. Our neighborhood has actually gotten closer. We have monthly community meetings now to ensure everyone's voices are heard. The elderly residents who were scammed are finally getting their money back. One sweet lady used her restitution payment to take her first vacation in 20 years. She sent me a postcard from Hawaii thanking me for standing up to the HOA. My wife's law firm has become something of an expert in HOA fraud cases. They've even started a special task force to help other communities audit their HOAs for similar scams. So far, they've uncovered fraud in 5 other neighborhoods. As for me, I've been invited to speak at several homeowners' rights conferences. It's crazy how many people have similar stories of HOA abuse. I always tell them the same thing. Keep your paperwork and don't be afraid to fight back. My grandfather's old house is looking better than ever. I found some of his old photos from the 70s and restored them to hang in the living room. Sometimes I look at his picture and think about how his careful record-keeping ended up exposing a massive fraud scheme. He would have loved that. The best part? Our neighborhood is so much friendlier now. We had a huge block party last weekend, no HOA approval needed. People are planting gardens, painting their houses fun colors, and generally just enjoying their homes without fear of harassment. I even installed a bright red mailbox just because I can. The old HOA would have had a meltdown over it, but now it just makes my neighbors smile. So I guess sometimes standing up to bullies really does make a difference. Not just for yourself, but for an entire community. Edit 3. Thanks for all the awards. Several people have asked if I'm writing a book about this. Actually, yes, a publisher contacted me after the case made national news. It should be out next year. Final update, 1 year later. I figured I should give you all one last update since a lot has happened, and this whole mess is finally wrapped up for good. The criminal case ended last month with the former HOA president pleading guilty to all charges. She tried to make a deal with prosecutors by offering to expose other HOA scams she knew about, but they already had everything they needed from her seized records. The judge gave her 8 years in federal prison plus 5 years of supervised release. She also has to pay back $1.2 million in restitution. Her attempt to hide assets didn't work out too well either. The forensic accountants found everything, even the cash she'd stuffed in a storage unit under her sister's name. They seized her house, sold at auction, 3 luxury cars, bank accounts in 4 states, a vacation condo in Florida, about $400,000 in investment accounts. Here's what really killed her case. They found a notebook where she'd written detailed plans for targeting specific homeowners. She had a whole system: go after elderly residents first, then focus on people who inherited homes, and finally pressure anyone who questioned the HOA's authority. The prosecutor said it was the most organized fraud scheme he'd seen in 20 years. The trial revealed she'd been running similar scams since the early 2000s. She would get herself elected to HOA boards, create fake rental agreements, then start demanding money from homeowners who weren't even part of the HOA. When people paid up, and many did, she'd pocket the cash and create more fake violations to keep the money flowing. One of her former board members testified against her, admitting they all knew something was off but were too scared to speak up. She apparently had dirt on everyone and wasn't afraid to use it. The board member got immunity for testifying, but still had to resign and pay back everything they'd received in bonuses. As for our neighborhood, things are completely different now. The new HOA board, elected under court supervision, actually serves the community instead of terrorizing it. They reduced monthly dues by 40%, eliminated most of the petty rules, created an oversight committee of non-board members, required annual audits by an outside firm, made all financial records available online. My wife's law firm is still handling cases against corrupt HOAs, but they say the number of complaints has dropped since our case made the news. Apparently, HOA boards are a lot more careful now that they know homeowners will fight back. The best part? Remember all those fake fines and fees the old HOA president collected? The court ordered that money returned with interest. My elderly neighbors who got scammed received checks last week. One of them called me crying. She got back $23,000 plus interest. She's using it to visit her grandkids in California. My own legal fees were fully covered by the settlement, and I received damages for harassment and attempted fraud. I donated most of it to a legal aid fund that helps people fight HOA abuse. Feels right to pay it forward. The newspaper did a follow-up story about how our case changed HOA oversight in the state. They interviewed me sitting on my front porch, right next to my definitely not HOA-approved red mailbox. The reporter asked if I was worried about sharing my story so publicly. I told her the truth, Bullies only win when people stay quiet. Last week, I got a letter from a homeowner in Arizona. She said our case gave her the courage to fight her own HOA's illegal demands. She won her case and kept her house. That means more to me than any settlement check. I still have all my grandfather's original paperwork framed in my office. His careful record-keeping didn't just save our house, it brought down an entire criminal enterprise. The lesson is clear. Document everything and never let anyone bully you off your own property. The house looks great now. We finished all the renovations my grandfather had planned but couldn't complete. The garden is thriving, the paint is fresh, and there's not a single HOA-approved anything in sight. Every morning when I have my coffee on the porch, I think about how close we came to losing this place to a scammer. But we didn't lose. We fought back and won. Not just for ourselves, but for everyone who's ever felt powerless against HOA abuse. Sometimes standing up for what's right has bigger consequences than you could ever imagine. So that's it, the final chapter in this crazy story. The scammer is in prison, the stolen money has been returned, and our neighborhood is stronger than ever. All because we refused to be bullied and had the paperwork to prove it. Thanks for following along on this wild ride. If there's one thing I hope people take from this, it's that you should never be afraid to fight back against injustice. Keep your records, know your rights, and don't let anyone tell you that standing up for yourself is wrong. As for me, I'm just enjoying my quiet life in my grandfather's house, surrounded by neighbors who finally feel free to be themselves. No fake rental agreements, no bogus fines, no power-tripping HOA presidents. Just a community of people who learned the hard way that justice is worth fighting for. Edit 5. Thanks for all the supportive messages. The legal aid fund we set up has already helped 3 families keep their homes from fraudulent HOA claims. Sometimes good really does come from bad situations.